Washington. A fortnight ago, Lend-Lease Administrator Edward R. Stettinius Jr. reported that Lend-Lease aid provided by the U.S. to the USSR up to March I totaled $1,825,600,000. Following Ambassador Stanley's accusation that the Russian public had not been receiving full information on the extent of U.S. assistance, release of these figures made many an American curious to know a little more about Washington-Moscow transactions. Above all, Americans wanted to know if their country was really helping Russia, and how the Red Army liked and employed what it received. The first question was easier to answer. Although Lend-Lease to aid Russia, in dollars, totals less than half of that sent to Britain, the USSR has been in the war only half as long. During the last 12 months, 29% of all Lend-Lease goods have gone to Russia. In the important categories of combat planes, tanks, and military vehicles, the USSR has been allotted more than any other Lend-Lease client. Half of all U.S. tanks shipped thus far under Lend-Lease have gone to the Red Army, and 40% of all the tactical planes. Since Lend-Lease shipments last year, combined with the direct foreign purchases, totaled one-third of U.S. production, the volume of tanks and planes sent to Russia was certainly enough to keep many a Red Army division well supplied and supported. Russia's reception of these tools of war has been somewhat enigmatic. U.S. officers stationed at the Russian supply base in Iran, funnel for all goods shipped via the southern route, report that Red Army pilots have expressed vast enthusiasm for the low-fighting Airacobra and the fast A-20 attack bombers, which are ideally suited for providing air support to the Russian armies. On the other hand, Soviet military authorities have repeatedly turned down U.S. requests for permission to observe Lend-Lease equipment in operation at the Russian front. Americans do not know for certain how our tanks, planes, and trucks behave once they have left the U.S. assembly plants in Iran. In return for assistance which the U.S. is willing and happy to give, American officials sometimes wish their Russian customers would be a little more candid, a little more extroverted, a little more informative as to their overall strategic requirements and aims. Lend-Lease is not only a great fact of the war but a testing ground for American-Russian relations. These two countries seem likely to emerge as the two greatest powers of the post-war era. Without their full and honest cooperation, there can be no stable, peaceful world. For photographs of some of the war implements which the U.S. is today shipping to this most crucial of all its allies, turn the page. Lend-Lease aid to Russia, as to all countries, embraces three categories: raw materials, foodstuffs, and implements of war. Of these, implements of war are the bulkiest and most emergency to ship. But their value can be most easily comprehended by the American and Russian people, and most quickly realized in terms of blood and battle on an active fighting front. On these pages you resotny of the precious but cumbers-worn military assets which daily are loaded aboard sturdy freighters in U.S. ports for transport to the embattled Red Army. The figures on the implements of war dispatched to Russia under the Lend-Lease program make spectacular reading. At Nong, the items shipped up to the first of this year were 2,600 planes, foreign little fighters to bombers, 3,200 tanks, Renani General Sherman MVS of late 130,000 submachine guns, 140,000 field telephones, and thousands of miles of telephone wire. In 1938 Henry Ford reared at River Rouge the sixth world's most advanced tire factory. Last week his $5,600,000 investment was being nailed in crates and dispatched piecemeal to Russia under the Lend-Lease program. When it arrives at its destination and begins production, the USSR will benefit by some 1,000,000 military truck tires a year. Ford's fabulous transshipment is an example of Lend-Lease operation at its best. For logistical experts have discovered that both time and shipping space may be saved by moving entire factories, rather than just their products, overseas. Also en route to Russian SIA. A $1,900,000 oil refinery. Scheduled for future shipment. Electric power plant. Mr. Ford completed his great River Rouge tire factory during peacetime 5 years ago. He fitted the last link in his great raw materials to finish automobile production chain. Now in the absence of rubber and civilian pleasure cars, he is disposing of a peacetime plant that he can no longer use. In return for his plant, Mr. Ford is getting Lend-Lease cash. By the end of last week, all of his giant Banbury presses had been crated and made ready to move. Ely's 5-ton mill rollers had received anti-rust treatment and were being crated. But several weeks' work still remained. Americans are bending over backwards to give needed items to their fighting Russian allies. To treat Russia's food shortage, the US has been shipping more and more foodstuffs to the USSR. In 1943 these shipments increased so fast that the US may send more food to Russia than to Hungary, England this year. Like the specially requested pork product, Tushonka, shown on this page, much of the foods for Russia have been high-energy foods containing meat and animal fats. But the US is also sending them dehydrated foods, many thousand tons of wheat, flour, sugar, beans, peas, rice, cereals, and vegetable oil. In addition to the vast quantities of goods obtained through Lend-Lease, the American people are chipping in with contributions of their own. It is about this voluntary aid that Ambassador Standley specifically charged the Russian government with not informing the Russian people. Russian War Relief Incorporated has raised more than $9 million for the Soviets since September 1941. This organization sends medical supplies, seeds to replant THC-scorched earth, and collects U.S. old clothing at the rate of £45,000 per week. Russians get no new clothes by Lend-Lease except shoes. The pairs of soldiers' boots convoyed to the USSR last year had much to do with their preparedness for this winter's offensive. Best recent example of the willingness of U.S. civilians to aid their allies with gifts is the Watches for Russia campaign in Seattle, WASH. In a short period of time more than 1,000 timepieces, opposite page, were donated. When the most accurate of them have been checked and repaired, they will be turned over to the USSR for use by doctors and nurses at the front. His IUC of life is all Russia, nothing else. It has taken months to collect and edit. Maybe the Russians won't like it, not because it is critical but because we don't always put things the way they would. All we can say is that we have tried to be good American journalists, and that, so far as our intentions are concerned, they are warm and friendly. We respect the mighty Russian people and admire them. Putting this issue together was quite an adventure. Life correspondent Walter Grebner was in charge of THC field work and he had a tough job. At that time the Russians were angry at Life because of some captions that they claimed were unfriendly to THC USSR. But even if they had loved us, they had almost no photographers available. And there was a desperate shortage of film, flashbulbs, and photographic paper. Problem was partly solved with captured German film, and at the last minute photographic paper was flown in from, of all places, Leningrad, which was tightly locked in siege but which happened to have a small supply. Various official agencies came to our aid, notably VOKS, THC agency in charge of cultural relations with the outside world, which put a big collection of 20,000 pictures at our disposal. And we finally got 4 photographers: Musinov, Tsitlin, Kislov and Atsersky. Musinov, the best, had little equipment and was suffering from ill health. But he got most pictures in the issue. Leaving Moscow, Grebner gave Musinov his own wide-angle lens, worth more to Musinov than diamonds. Free speech. We have done this issue for one chief reason. There are 2 ways by which nations can come close together, one is through their state departments. The other is through popular sympathy and understanding. The editors of Life can't do anything about the U.S. State Department. We can, however, help our readers to see and understand the Russian, and we'd like to think maybe Russian journalists will undertake a similar project about the U.S. Of course, the Russians don't entirely agree with this idea. They live under a system of tight state-controlled information. But probably the attitude to take toward this is not to get too excited about it. When we take account 01 what the USSR has accomplished L in the years of its existence, we can make allowances for certain shortcomings, however deplorable. For that matter, Even 15 years ago the Russian had scarcely yet changed from the days of the Tsars, and the kulaks of the steppes were still treating modern industrial machines like new toys. In 1929 the Soviet Union did not have a single automobile or tractor plant and did not produce high-grade steel or ball bearings. Today the USSR ranks among the top 3 or 4 nations in industrial power. She has improved her health, built libraries, raised her literacy to about 80% and trained one of TH's most formidable armies on earth. It is safe to say that no nation in history has ever done so much so fast. If the Soviet leaders tell that the control of information was necessary to get this job done, we can afford to take their word for it for the time being. WC who know the power of free speech, and the necessity for it, may assume that if those leaders are sincere in their work of emancipating the Russian people they will swing around toward free speech, and we hope soon. Big and modern. There are a number of salient points about THC-USSR which this issue illustrates in one way or another. THC first is that the Soviet Union is huge. As we said on this page some time ago, it takes THC sun 11 hours to cross that land, as against 4 hours to cross the US and 5 to the Atlantic Ocean. It is farther in degrees of longitude from Moscow to Ceylon, on the Bering Strait, than from San Francisco to London. To this staggering fact there should be appended, however, a note for THC New World. If the fly a great circle route, almost over the pole, Yulton is only a little farther from Moscow than the tip of Newfoundland from San Francisco. And incidentally, from Seattle to Moscow across the pole is almost THC same distance as New York to Moscow across THC Atlantic, a fact that may mean much to our Northwest in the future. Like the US, the USSR is a huge melting pot. Only in a different way. It contains 175 nationalities speaking about 150 languages and dialects. They don't mix as much as our ethnic groups do, yet THC system by which all these peoples are held together runs parallel to ours in that it is a federation. There are 54 autonomous units in TBCCSS regions, territories. One big fact that keeps cropping up about Russia is its modernity. In a way, this was true even in the days of the Tsars. For the Russian court was always quick to seize the latest gadgets, ideas, and philosophies. But THC Soviet Union has extended modernity to the people. For instance, our Yushian electric power plants are among the most modern in the world. The new Soviet architecture is very advanced. The Russians are great aviators. And they have come to have a feeling for modern machinery almost as intense as their feeling of patriotism. This love of modernity is especially important when we think of our future relations with Russia. It would, of course, profit us nothing to try to decide which of the great powers will be most important to us as time goes on. Yet it is clear that, each in its separate way, 3 are indispensable: Britain, China, and the USSR. The future peace, too we can ever win it, must be integrated with all 3. And realistic. The process of integrating our future with the USSR is bound to be a slow one. Though we both have the same aims, the advancement of our peoples, the methods we employ are in many cases diametrically opposed. One thing we can count on in the light of the record is that the USSR is realistic. For instance, before Munich, she had been the greatest advocate of collective security, but when she saw that the democracies would not support that policy, she turned completely around and gained time to prepare herself by signing a pact with Hitler. Conceivably, having been forced to play a lone hand, at terrible cost in Russian lives, she will find it realistic to go on playing it in the future. Such a decision would doubtless lead to claims on nearby territory, such as the Baltic nations, to the annexation of strategic areas and the setting up of satellite states, all in the name of security. And however this might violate our ideas of a just and stable peace, THCRC is little we could do to prevent it. Yet realism, while admirable so far as it goes, has manifest dangers. Russia should not forget that our isolationists are very fond of that word. They argue that our realistic self-interest is to stay out of all the trouble we can. If, now, THC Russian realists argue that their self-interest is to play a ioni hand, nothing but grief can come to either of us. Clearly it is up to both the USSR and the US to seek a broader and more enlightened Basque for their future relationship. On Rus-Euro-IA's part, we think, she must try to overcome the suspicion which she to harbor against all democratic peoples. Russia should realize that she has strong friends in the S. and should give friends help and by opening the channels of information and goodwill. We on our part have a twofold task to perform. Our first task, which must take precedence over everything, is to launch a fierce attack on the continent of Europe. Our second task is longer range but no less important. It is to clear up the doubt in Russia's mind, and in the minds of other nations, concerning our willingness to enter a collective security system. IHS we must set about at once. Indeed, the recent resolution intro, ducate in the Senate by Senators Ball, Hill, Burton, and Hatch is a good firm step in the right direction. It deserves the support of every American who seeks peace with the other great peoples of THC Earth. Any citizens OTTBC USSR has to be called Russians. Their reason is that their country is a federation of IG Union republics among which the people known as the Great Russians are only one. The USSR is a hemisphere, cradling the vast areas whereof THC races of THC West brawled for count. Less entries. It is a huge melting pot of bloods, ranging the tundra dwellers and modem nomads OT the steppes to Buddhist Mongols and city men west. What brought in these people into one Maviran entity was the race of Great Russians, a prolific, gregarious, talkative, aggressive and friendly mass of blonde Slavs who have conquered and colonized a sixth of the Earth's lawed surfaces. They had Siberia and reached the Pacific 2 years ago. They will go anywhere and try anything. They were one hell or a 1*0 ple long before the revolution. To a remarkable degree. They look like Americans, dress like Americans and think like Americans. People were talking about Russia as the country of the future 100 years ago. Even when Russia was loaded with OT the undesirable rulers in history, it was producing great writers. Gene THC greatest men of Russia, were invariably to the decadent Russian system. A century ago a cabal of aristocratic land-holding Ussrs organized a society resembling Lenin's Bolsheviks to get rid of the Tsar and set up a republic ruled without the consent of the people for the people's own good. Ivan the Terrible ran against his own boyars that has been commissioner to Stalin's revolution in 1929 against the kulaks. The present system of government in the VSSR is not as strange and alien to THC stream OT Russia's history as it may appear. Yet it is scientific, nor the Russians be judged by values that are the product of our Western history. Opals the Great Russians exenquered mostly Cupida of empty space, but that empty has become with air power one of the world's crucial areas, dominating air route across THC arity Euro. Spaces have received a burst or development unparalleled in Tsarist times. The peoples who occupied them were not, like the American Indians, exiled from their land, though the Russians colonized the central track across Siberia and made Tsarist Russia OT nations. They survived and now, ripe for greatness, are being fostered as sovereign by the Soviets. On these and following pages is shown OT this fantastic mosaic of races and cultures of the USSR are actually Russian Slavs. But the standout fact about the USSR is that its native race is not one, but 175 peoples. They speak 150 different languages and dialects and believe in dozens of different religions. They are organized in IG autonomous union republics and many autonomous states. Each republic has its own constitution, courts, cabinet, whatever religions it wants and the theoretical right to secede. Not only does each people speak and write its ancient and native language, but the Soviets foster this cultural nationalism among all the 175 peoples that for dark centuries have gabbled an unwritten gibberish without alphabet or recorded literature have been given an alphabet and have taken to publishing books. Approximately 40 such languages have been recovered from the abyss of illiteracy and launched into historic culture. Thus the Gilyaks and the Yagnobians, the Kets and the Karagas, and a score more, can now see their traditional songs and legends in print and have begun to write new ones. Naturally, Great Russian is taught as a second language in all the schools. This is unquestionably the greatest peaceful story in the world today. What will come of it is impossible to say, whether a brawl of bickering nationalisms or a great outpouring of energy, wit, and beauty. Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Azerbaiджans, Tatars are fighting today together for the USSR, welding a true union. On these pages are shown only a characteristic 18 of the U.S.S.R.S. 175 peoples. Roughly they are divided into the Slavic group, 5 million Japhetides of the Caucasus, 20 million Turco-Tatars centered in Central Asia east of the Caspian Sea, 4,500,000 Finno-Ugrians of the north, plus various basic Iranian, Mongolian, Jewish, German, Greek, Siberian and Baltic stocks. The father of modern Russia, perhaps the greatest man of modern times, was Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. He took the name Lenin, spent most of his 54 years in exile from his Kauno, and gave the world the biggest new political fact of our era, the Federal Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under a form of communism. The impression of integrated force he gave in life may be sensed in the portrait above, taken not long before his great step to power. Lenin was that rarest of men, an absolutely unself-conscious and unselfish man who had a passionate respect for ideas, but even more respect for deeds. Il had mastered the trick of complete concentration. Il had a fantastic capacity for work and was scrupulous and thorough about the smallest, as well as the biggest, duties of his life. He spoke English one-ish, German and French, as well as Russian, and could read Italian, Swedish and Polish. Il was a normal, well-balanced man who was dedicated to rescuing people from a brutal and incompetent tyranny. Il did what he set out to do. Lenin did not make the revolution in Russia, nor did any one organized group of men. But he made the revolution make sense and saved it from much of the folly of the French Revolution. It is impossible to imagine what the history of Russia and the world would have been had he not lived. From Leninism to Stalinism, as Lenin writhed on his sickbed IU 1923, he was master of a strange half-capitalist, half-socialist state. After the Civil War, Lenin and his advisors had relaxed the absolute controls of war communism in favor of the new economic policy, 1921. The NEP permitted peasants to sell food surplus in the open market and allowed small private trade and manufacturing to start up again. When Lenin died in January 1924, there were two powerful leaders among his associates who might have taken over. One was the brilliant, talkative, erratic, middle-class Leon Trotsky, a thinker and a dreadnoughter. The other was the strong, tough, silent proletarian man of action, Joseph Stalin. Trotsky was on his way south for a rest cure when he received the news of Lenin's demise. For some reason he did not return to Moscow in time for the funeral. It was a break for Stalin, the general secretary of the party, who had steadily been forcing Trotsky into the background as he was assigned more and more of Lenin's duties during the latter's illness. Although he continually opposed many Bolshevik decisions, Trotsky was not expelled from the party until 1927. He went into exile, leaving behind a secret network of opposition which strove for years to undermine the government. Assassination of a prominent Soviet leader, Sergei M. Kirov, in 1934, led to the treason trials from 1935 to 1938, during which Stalin ruthlessly eliminated the so-called Trotskyist fifth column. With the departure of Trotsky went much of the zeal for world revolution. Stalin was content to build socialism first in the USSR. His first five-year plan, 1928-32, set as its objective the wiping out of the last tiges of capitalism which had been temporarily permitted under Lenin's NEP. In the third five-year plan, the Soviets announced themselves ready to compete for economic primacy with the US, but the approach of war compelled a shift to the manufacture of armaments. At Lenin's death the Soviets were embarked on many great internal crusades. The violent campaign against religion was not checked until the middle of the last decade when the 1936 Constitution guaranteed freedom of religious worship. Other early crusades were against bourgeois concepts of the family and morality. But now the pendulum has swung the other way, divorces are harder to obtain, the family is glorified, and sexual looseness is condemned. In the late 1920s and early 1930s the threat of world revolution became more than a talking point. Although the much-feared Communist International met at intervals in Moscow to agree on a worldwide propaganda policy, the Soviet government and Stalin kept busy mending international fences, hoping to avert war so that the USSR could gain strength. The Soviets signed the Bryant-Kellogg Pact, were recognized by the US in 1900, were admitted as members of the League of Nations in 1934, and under the aegis of then Foreign Commissar Litvinov tried to establish collective security as a method of thwarting the rising tide of fascism. But the League collapsed and was followed by appeasement at Munich, the Soviet-Nazi Non-Aggression Pact in 1939 and the entrance of the Reds into the war when Hitler invaded them on June 22, 1941. These events brought the Soviets to the peak of a new nationalist phase in which internationalism was at least temporarily shelved. The Russia of today looks back on and admires the strong points of its pre-revolutionary past, its iron-handed czars, its brilliant generals, its romantic writers, poets, and musicians. Today, these pre-revolutionary figures share the esteem of the Soviet people with Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, above, and are better known than many of the present-day Red leaders shown on pages 40 to 41. Governments, regardless of political character, are only as efficient as their leaders. Leaders of Union of Soviet Socialist Republics are, above all, extremely efficient administrators. They did not achieve high office because their personalities, their looks, their voices, their families, or their education. They fought to the top crust because they were able to prove themselves tough, intelligent executives, loyal to the USSR. Though Russia's leaders live well, they get no financial rewards such as comparable men earn in capitalist countries. But they wield tremendous power and often have cities named after them. Their private lives are so private that the Russian people know little about them but their names, offices, and deeds. The USSR is a federation of 16 union republics and many autonomous states. The voters elect representatives not only to their local councils, or Soviets, but to the governing bodies of their provinces, republics, and federation. USS candidates for office are nominated through organizations such as youth, sports, by labor unions, cooperatives, and the Communist Party. In practice, all candidates are approved by the party and there seldom is more than one candidate for each post. The slate procedure of nominating is more like that used in a U.S. union election. Most of the government leaders shown on this and the following pages were active in the work of the Communist Party before they were elected to any government position. If elected as government officials, communists do not resign their party assignments. Stalin, for example, has several vital government portfolios but still manages to hold down his key job as General Secretary of the Communist Party, which he took over in 1922. No government post except Chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Since then he has taken over several portfolios, most recently, Marshal of the Red Army. Red leaders, continued, Lazar M. Kaganovich, Stalin's troubleshooter, is one of the best administrators in the USSR. He is a Ukrainian Jew, born in 1893, who started life as a shoemaker and joined Communist Party in 1911. He is now on the Central Committee. After he ably directed the construction of the Moscow subway, he was given the job of reorganizing the country's railroads, and in 1937 he became Commissar of Heavy Industry. Successful in both these posts, Kaganovich was awarded the Order of Lenin and elected vice chairman of Council of People's Commissars. His sister Rosa is supposedly married to Stalin. Anastas L. Mikoyan, an Armenian by birth, has held important cabinet positions in the USSR since 1926 when he was appointed Commissar of Internal Supply. In 1934 this former theological student became Commissar of the Food Industry, and in 1938 he switched over to the Commissariat for Foreign Trade, a post which he still holds. Isle is the only present Commissar besides Molotov who has ever visited the U.S. Isle also is a member of the State Defense Committee, organized on June 30, 1941, and holds a high-ranking post in the Communist Party's Politburo and in the Supreme Soviet. Andrei Zdanov. Zdanov, son of a Russian priest, is one of Stalin's closest friends and often mentioned as his possible successor. Primarily an energetic party worker and organizer, he has held many key party positions in the last decade. He joined the Bolsheviks in 1913 at THCAGC of 17. In 1938 he was elected chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee and as such is considered the architect of USSR foreign policy, whereas Molotov is the builder. Last month Zdanov was made a lieutenant general in the Red Army as partial recognition for his work as a member of the Military Council of the Leningrad Front. Lavrentiy Beria. Like Stalin, Beria is a native of Georgia. An architect by trade, Beria is very well educated. In 1941, when the 60 Commissariats of State Security and Internal Affairs were merged into the United NKVD, a national police similar to the FBI, he became chief of the joint organization. Assignments of Beria and NKVD at present time are enforcement of Stalin's scorched earth policy and tracking down of traitors. For military and revolutionary merits, Beria, who is State Defense Committee member, has been awarded the Order of Lenin and the Military Order of the Red Banner. Klavdia Nikolava is only woman member of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet since the death of Krupskaya, Lenin's widow. She was born in 1893, daughter of a day laborer. A folder in a print shop, she joined the Bolsheviks in 1909, was twice sent to exile for her underground activities. She has been called the most popular woman in Russia. In 1941-42, as co-leader with Shvernik, below, of a delegation to Britain, she showed an inarked ability to analyze production problems. She is secretary of the All-Union Council of Trade Unions and a member of the party's Central Committee. Nikolai M. Shvernik. As chairman of the All-Union Council of Trade Unions, Shvernik is top labor leader. Since he took this post in 1930, union membership has risen from 12 to 26 millions. Shvernik was born in St. Petersburg in 1888, the son of a doorman. He became a machinist's apprentice. At 17 he joined the Bolsheviks and was elected to a union post. As unions were outlawed, he was exiled. During the 1917 revolution, Shvernik headed the Artillery Workers' Union. Last winter he was appointed chairman of a committee to investigate loss of life and damage to property caused by the Nazis. Alexei Shcherbakov is head of THC system of political commissars for the Red Army and an assistant commissar of defense under Stalin. He is also chief of the Soviet Information Bureau and leader of the Moscow City and Regional Committee of the party. Shcherbakov was born into a working-class family in 1901 in the city of Ryazan near Moscow. He began working at 12, joined the Red Guard, civilian militia around which the Red Army was built, at 16 and the party a year later. A political writer ranked high in party circles, he was elected chairman of the Union of Soviet Writers in 1934. Nikolai Voznesensky. Voznesensky is probably the most brilliant of the new Bolsheviks. The youngest member of the State Defense Committee and alternate of the Politburo of the CPSU, he was born in Tula province in 1903, son of a white-collar worker. He entered the party in 1919. On the advice of Stalin and Molotov in 1908, Voznesensky drafted the Third Five-Year Plan, which made preparations for organizing industry in the interior in case of war. That same year he was made chairman of the State Planning Commission. Isle also serves as vice chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. Red leaders government and party set UPS. The chart below outlines the structure of the federal government of the USSR and shows the relationship of the Communist Party to that government. The chart does not indicate the administrative set UPS for the Soviets of autonomous republics, regions, districts, cities, or villages. Each of these areas directly elects its own government, as do our states, counties, cities, and villages. Control of political and economic life in the USSR is centered in the Communist Party. The Constitution of 1936, which makes voting universal, equal, direct, and secret, does not permit formation of political groups other than the party. While many non-communists are elected to government bodies, the party controls most administrative organs and its loyal members occupy many responsible posts. Thus this small party of 4,610,000 formulates all important policies for a nation of 193 million, and the party decisions are then carried through by the administrative machinery. The relatively small membership is partly due to rigid requirements which make it difficult for a non-communist to join the fold. Thus Joseph Stalin is undisputed top man in the USSR primarily because of his position as Secretary General of the party. Now he is also chairman of the Council of People's Commissars. This council is similar to our cabinet, and has portfolios for armaments, navy, foreign affairs, etc. Close in importance to Stalin is his old Bolshevik sidekick, Vyacheslav Molotov, who is Commissar of Foreign Affairs and a member of the party's political bureau. Mikhail Kalinin, erroneously called President of the Soviet Union, is actually chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, a job like that of Speaker of our House. The Supreme Soviet, a two-house Congress, has 1,298 deputies elected for a term of 4 years. The Presidium, or Executive Committee, has 42 members elected by the Supreme Soviet to carry on its work while the larger body is not in session. The greatest American collector of modern Russian art is the capitalist lawyer who was U.S. ambassador to the USSR before the war, Joseph E. Davies. The paintings reproduced on the following pages are from his collection. Now at the University of Wisconsin. Many of them are copies painted on his order in Moscow, because the Soviets would not permit him to buy the originals. The picture above was taken in his Washington house before a part of his huge collection of Russian porcelain. Just behind his head is a 150-year-old tea set decorated with cupids that Catherine the Great had made for one of the Orlov brothers, her lovers, who helped put her husband out of the way. The picture above Davies' head is a pre-revolutionary scene from an Easter festival. Russian painting is not very impressive, but it satisfies the Russians. Church art, the production of sacred icons, overshadowed lay painting until the revolution. Since then Soviet painting has worked up to where American painting was in George Caleb Bingham's time, the 1860s, though Soviet book illustration, porcelains, rugs, carved ivories, wood carvings, lacquer work, and posters are excellent. Subtleties of modern painting do not much interest the communists, for art in the USSR, like everything else, has a job to do. It does its job of education very well. Leave their families to enter the Tsar's armies of the end of the 19th century. This is a copy of the painting by K. A. Savitsky now in J. Leningrad's Russian Museum. The government refused to part with the original. Weighed down with unmilitary lions, including a teapot, some of the young men regret this parting. While two at left center are seen lancing. These soldiers went out into the Russia of overbearing Alexander Ill, who persecuted non-Tussians, strangled the press, tried to save the bankrupt gentry, but expanded the railway system. Note the old-fashioned engine in the background. The troops of Alexander, and 110 died in 1891, fought only subject races. The replies to these questions submitted by the editors do not reflect any current official opinion of either the Soviet Union or of the United States, $0 far as I know. Nor are the answers intended to be dogmatic. They are simply my own opinions, for SNCB value as they may heart. They are based WPN published sources of information, and upon facts within my own knowledge, and represent my considered judgment. 1. Can we assume that TBT rulers of Russia are men of goodwill toward other nations and that they desire a stable world? Yes. Their public statements of policy and their dicts in THC Pastgat both establish that. Ambassador Litvinov, when he was foreign minister, both within and without the League of Nations, was the outstanding advocate of collective action by the non-aggressor nations, in order to ensure a peaceful and stable world. War anywhere, he constantly urged, would engulf all the rest of us, for peace was indivisible. Abyssinia, Spain, China, the attitude of THC Soviets in agreeing to stand by Czechoslovakia with France against attack by Germany all attest to their sincerity as men of goodwill. It is, also, to their practical best interest to have peace with, and in, the world. 2. Will Russia pursue a Ione Wolf policy after the war, or will SBE seek to cooperate with the other great powers in creating a stable world? That will depend upon what kind of world they will then face, or upon what kind of a world they think they are facing. If they believe in, and trust the proposals of Great Britain, China, and ourselves, and the United Nations, they will, in my opinion, go as far as any of these in a high-minded and altruistic effort to cooperate in creating a stable and decent world. If, on the other hand, they believe they are not getting a square deal on a reciprocal and high-minded basis, they will not hesitate to go it alone. They will not be taken for a ride. Nor will they be used to pull anyone's chestnuts out of the fire. They will do exactly what we would do, if in their shoes. 3. Will Russia seek to create some kind of world federation, embodying some transfer of sovereignty from TB member states to the central government? Or will JHE favor voluntary cooperation by the great powers to maintain a stable world? The Soviets vigorously supported the League of Nations and constantly advocated a stronger and more effective league. They are, however, essentially practical and realistic in THC application of their ideals. First things first is the motto of the Soviets. They, I feel sure, would be willing to give up so much of their sovereignty as would assure a strong federation to outlaw war, aggression, and conquest, and to establish an international police force to keep the peace for the world community of nations. What other and further relinquishments of sovereignty they would agree to would depend upon how practical and unselfish the proposals were, and upon their confidence in the good faith of the other large nations. 4. Will Russia be willing to undertake any international commitments which involve revealing military information to other nations? Yes, if it is upon a fair and reciprocal basis, and for the honest purpose of protecting the peace of the world community against gangsters, outlaws, or terrorists. 5. Winston Churchill once described our ideology on foreign policy as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Can you make sense of it? What are its fundamental aims? In my opinion, THC's best approach to THC solution of the riddle is to forget the epigram and set to one side the idea of either an enigma or a mystery. The riddle, if riddle there be, from my experience can be best solved by THC's simple approach of assuming that what they say, they mean, that they are honest in their beliefs, speak the truth and keep their promises. If one were to assume, also, that they were strong, able, courageous, and willing to treat others honestly, if they believe they are treated honestly themselves, the riddle can be answered with reasonable certainty. As a matter of fact, in my opinion, the foreign policy of the Soviet government is quite clear. Its first concern is to ensure THC territorial security of the Soviet Union. They built up a great military and industrial system for that purpose. The Soviet government is not a predatory power like Germany or Japan. It was only after Hitler came into power that the great industrial development projected by Stalin was speeded up for war purposes. Once that security is established, the Soviet policy is to develop the USSR internally. That can best be done in a peaceful world. The Soviet foreign policy therefore has been consistently addressed to the prevention of war. When they lost faith in both the will and the capacity of the Western democracies to join them realistically to stop Hitler, they still tried to maintain their security and their peace by entering into a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. That was not a pact for a mutual offensive against Germany's enemies. In that particular, it provided only that neither would attack the other. They gained precious time which they feverishly employed to protect their security against the inevitable Nazi attack. After this war there will be still greater need for PKC to promote their plans for the internal development of their country. There is no riddle or mystery if the statements of the Soviet government, or its leaders, are read in the light of these policies. They are straightforward and direct. 6. Is there religious freedom in Russia? The Constitution of the Soviet Union, Art 124, provides that freedom of religious worship and freedom of anti-religious propaganda is recognized for citizens. By this same article the Church is separated from the state and the school to ensure citizens' freedom of conscience. Article of the Constitution provides that religion shall be no bar to THC right of THC citizens either to vote or to hold office. Prior to the enactment of Article 135, which is attributed indirectly by some to the attitude of THC President in his recognition of the USSR in 1933, several nations including THC United States were guaranteed that their citizens in the Soviet Union should have 1. Full liberty of conscience and religious worship, free from persecution, 2. The right to hold religious services in churches or buildings selected for that purpose, free from molestation, and 3. THC right to impart religious instruction to their children. That, however, did not include the right to proselyte outside those restrictions. In 1937 there were about 100,000 ministers of religion in THC Soviet Union, according to THC chairman of the Atheist League of THC USSR. The Russian Orthodox Church of the Soviet Union is militantly supporting the government in this war. The highest prelate, acting Metropolitanskrixy of Moscow, has appealed for THC tolerance of religious people outside Russia and has urged that such people be not misled by fascist propaganda or believe their lies as to persecution of the Church in recent years. A book devoted to TB Truth About Religion in Russia was recently published in Moscow by the Orthodox hierarchy, addressed to providing accurate information on religion in the Soviet Union. There is no question, however, that despite these constitutional guarantees THCRC is much hostility toward religion in the party membership. I was reliably informed when in Moscow that the objections raised to THC adoption of these constitutional provisions were overcome by Premier Stalin's personal advocacy of their passage. 7. Is Russia determined to pursue the cause of world revolution? In my opinion, no. The Stalin 5-year policy clearly set aside the Trotsky idea of world revolution. It was one of the alleged betrayals of the revolution charged by the Trotskyists. The Soviets and the post-war, continued. 8. If Russia given up her ambition to turn the world communist, may fear capitalist encirclement and attack. SBE nevertheless. THAT depends upon whether they think that they have reason for such fear. Much will therefore depend upon how the rest of the world approaches the problem of post-war reconstruction, and the attitude of the other nations toward the USSR. If there are evidences of hostility on the part of the outside world, they will certainly detect it and protect themselves. Before Russia entered the war, Russian distrust of the Western powers was very real. On the morning following Hitler's night attack, June 22, there were highly informed persons in Moscow who believed that Britain would launch a simultaneous naval attack through the Baltic Sea in conjunction with, and pursuant to, an agreement with THC Nazis. That fear was only relieved when Prime Minister Churchill's broadcast came over the air, pledging all-out aid to Russia. The developments in the conduct of the war, I believe, through contacts and better understanding, have definitely contributed to dissipating the classic fear of capitalistic encirclement and attack. 9. Even if Russia is not interested in promoting world revolution for its own sake, will she still use revolutionary activity as an instrument of Russian nationalism? May she, for instance, promote communist revolutions in Europe? In Asia? This idea is again being vigorously and assiduously preached by Goebbels and other Nazi propagandists, both in and out of Germany. The express oral assurances of Premier Stalin, the commitments contained in THC Joint Declaration by THC United Nations, and the treaty made with England have definitely killed that Hitler bugaboo which he has tried desperately, and without success, to sell to Europe these many years. The Soviet Union has an enviable record as a nation for keeping its obligations. Except as an instrument of military necessity, THC Soviet Union will not promote dissension in the internal affairs of other nations. 10. What do you think is the probable extent of Russia dollar territorial demands? It would be natural for them to demand what any other people would, under similar circumstances. First, they would naturally want that back which had previously been taken away from them by force after the last war. After that, it would be natural for them to require any such territory as that which they considered to be vital to their security in the event of possible future European attack. The probable extent of Russia's territorial demands will therefore depend, in my opinion, upon what conditions are when peace comes and upon what kind of a world they think is going to come out of THC peace. It should be remembered that THC Baltic states were all carved out of, and taken away from Russia, after the last war. It is also the fact that the very Germany, which they are now fighting, in 1917 and 1918 took away from Russia nearly all of the territory gained westward since the accession of Peter the Great, including THC Ukraine and White Russia. It would be only natural that they should want to get it back from a defeated Germany. 5 million Ukrainians were arbitrarily converted into Polish citizens after the last war. Bessarabia, which was taken from Russia at about this time by Romania, had been Russian for years. The United States refused to recognize Bessarabia officially as a part of Romanian territory. It could be contended with much force that Soviet claims to all of this territory would not be territorial aggrandizement and would not be inconsistent with PLCDGCS made by the Soviet government either in the treaty with Britain last June, or with the covenants contained in the Joint Declaration of the United Nations made in January 1942, in Washington. It could be contended that the acquisition of such territories did not constitute aggression, but simply the restoration to the Soviets of that which has been taken from them by force and the rectifying of previous wrongs. Further, if THC Soviet government believes that it is confronted with the same type of world which existed before this war, they will undoubtedly require that which self-preservation demanded in this war, namely, a sufficient extension of territory on its western frontier to make itself secure against possible European attack. That would mean a part of Finland and, possibly, a part of Poland up to the Curzon line. That, it will be remembered, was the link determined by the Curzon Commission under the Versailles Treaty as the line of racial demarcation of the Polish and Russian nationalities. Last year, when THC Soviet-British Treaty was signed, providing for a mutual assistance pact in the event of an attack upon Ussr for a period of 2 years, both Britain and the Soviet Union were satisfied to leave the solution of controversial questions to be settled after the fighting was over by the application of certain broad equitable principles. That was wise. It is no time to fight among ourselves until Hitler and THC Nazis are thoroughly beaten. At that time the question of the Polish border was raised, according to the press. It was reported that General Sikorski and the Polish government were agreeable to that disposition of the problem in the interest of unity in the war effort. After the British-Soviet Treaty, which from PRCSS accounts SCCMED to have BCCN approved by General Sikorski, great numbers of Polish prisoners held by Russia were freed, and some 100,000 Polish soldiers were released, armed by Great Britain and the United States, and organized as a fighting force against Hitler. They are now in the Middle East. I am very sympathetic with the Polish Kapelk, but it could scarcely be expected that the Soviets would remain mute when these controversial frontier matters were recently brought up in London, particularly in the face of what appeared to the Soviets to be an implied consent to the postponement of the determination of the issue until after victory. The Soviets, obviously, could not permit THCSC claims to be asserted without contradiction, without themselves being stopped at some future time from asserting their viewpoint, upon which naturally they would wish to be heard. It is significant that it is not the Soviets who are now pressing, so far as THC United States is concerned, for decisions upon these controversial matters. After victory has been won, conditions may be entirely different from those existing now. Many things may happen in THC interim. THC science of war is being completely revolutionized by air power. Frontiers such as rivers and mountains, providing bases for fortifications, have lost much of their importance. The war has already shown that thousands of paratroopers may be transported to strike at vital centers in the interior, by simply passing over the frontier land fortifications. Boundaries may not be of such vital importance in a reconstructed and peaceful world. Moreover, the terms of THC peace may, and probably will, provide for mutual defense agreements for collective security, which will reduce the necessity for military defenses and armaments. It is unthinkable that such little, at least, would not be THC result of the war. Under such conditions, it is not beyond possibility that the Soviets might consider, in the interest of a peaceful world, that the matter of the extension of its frontiers was not a matter of vital protection against a possible recurrence of German attack. Certainly, the comradeship and understanding developed by mutual fighting against Hitler and aggression will provide solvents for these knotty questions. Continued. What does Russia regard as her proper spheres of influence? That would again depend upon the character of the world which THC Soviet government would confront at the conclusion of THC war. If THC post-war world can be assured of the enforcement of one principle, to wit, that military power cannot be used by any nation to enforce its will, then these questions of vital interest can be determined on the basis of equity and decency. THC Soviets, I believe, would go as far as any nation to bring that about. To answer the question flatly, however, there is no doubt that there are CCX in matters in which Russia has a vital interest. There is the matter of access to the SCA and warm water ports. That, particularly, affects THC Pacific and THC Mtitarankan. Russia has always been concerned with the ports of Port Arthur and Darien on the Pacific side, of which she was deprived in 1905. Again, the use by her and other nations of the highway which THC Dardanelles affords for shipping and an outlet from THC Black Sea, and through THC Mtitarankan to the oceans, would naturally and rightly be a matter of concern. Also, realistically, in a hostile or an anarchic world, self-preservation might demand the thrusting forth of their defenses against a possible repetition of German attack through the territory of smaller states adjacent to Russia, which are not strong enough themselves to prevent a strong Germany, or other aggressor, from making a highway of these smaller countries to attack the Soviet Union. To illustrate, the Great Sea base of Kronstadt, and the city of Leningrad, are only miles from the Finnish border and within easy reach of German long-range guns. THC Soviet Union made a very strong effort to come to an agreement with the Finn.sh government, whereby the Soviets could compensate them FCR concessions of territories which WCRC vital to Soviet defense against German attack. These THC Finnish government, in favor of Germany, was unable to conquer because, obviously, they were under THC German gun and, unfortunately, still are. Presumably, all of these vital interests and others, such as fair access to raw materials, THC common use of THCCs and THC air as highways for all of THC nations in THC world community, and similar matters, must ultimately be adjusted on a basis of reciprocity and a fair balancing of the interests of the various states, if there is to be a stable peace. Their determination must be governed under rules of decency and equity as BCTWCCN neighbors who desire peace for mutual advantage, even though they be friendly economic competitors. I believe that the Soviet Union would cooperate wholeheartedly and would contribute positively to that end, once convinced of the good faith and reliability of her associates. The attitude of THC Soviets, no less than that of other nations, upon these vital matters will therefore depend entirely upon the kind of peace that is to be established to secure a decent, desirable, and stable world to live in. 12. Will Russia be prepared to back up her demands with arms if we oppose them? If the Soviets face an anarchic world, where not PKC but war confronts them, THCY can and will back up THIRD security by force of arms if that is the only alternative. That, I am sure, would be far from their desire. 13. If other states go CR-immunist and voluntarily apply for admission to the USSR, will Russia admit them? Can T safely permit $? If states adjacent to the Soviet Union should voluntarily apply for admission to THC-USSR, I have no doubt that they would be admitted. If that were done, both countries being willing, it would be my opinion that it was none of our business, nor would our safety be necessarily imperiled thereby. If any such states were not contiguous to the borders of the Soviet Union, such application might possibly be embarrassing to the Soviets, but I doubt it. In any event, in my opinion, they would resolve such problems in a practical and realistic way in cooperation with those nations that were associated with them in the common enterprise of keeping the peace of the world community. In this connection there has been much agitation directed from Berlin to the possibility that THC success of the Soviet armies might result in communizing Europe. It is the same old red herring drawn across the trail. Anyone who knows Europe knows full well that neither the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, nor Poland nor Romania nor Hungary nor Greece nor Czechoslovakia would ever voluntarily accept communism nor the Soviet system. And it will be a long time before the Soviets will ever call their Frenchmen or Germans tovarish after this war. 14. What will be Russia dollar policy toward the defeated nations? There is no doubt but that, like the rest of us, they would wish to see even-handed and exact justice done, under law and without passion. This would require that those in the defeated nations who were responsible for crime would be duly tried by a judicial body and, if after due process, they were found to be guilty, then punishment suitable to the crime would be administered. Undoubtedly the Soviets would also require that all necessary safeguards would be established to prevent defeated nations from again breaking the peace and indulging in mass murder. Apart from these, the policy of the Soviets would, I think, be dictated solely by humanitarian considerations. Premier Stalin's published utterances abundantly support that conclusion. 15. What would be Russia's attitude toward a European federation, not including herself and Great Britain? It would clearly depend upon the character of such federation. If it were to contain the seed of either actual or potential aggression, the Soviets would oppose it, just as we all would. Assuming that it was part of a general plan to secure world peace through collective action, and that it was so set up as to prevent domination by any potentially strong aggressor unit in it, I do not think that the Soviets would oppose it. 16. On what basis can a stable settlement in Asia be made between Russia and China? Both Russia and China, in my opinion, have leaderships which are sincere in their search to secure a peaceful world. Both of these leaderships are practical and wise. Both recognize that there can be no peace if force is to be used by either as an instrument of national policy to enforce THC will of either over the other. Both, I believe, to secure a peaceful world, will actively try to establish an effective international police. That accomplished, there is within these two countries sufficient capacity for fairness and tolerance to settle all matters of difference if any such exist, through reciprocal arrangements on a fair and equitable basis as between themselves, and if not, each, I am sure, governed by a decent respect for the opinion of mankind, would submit certificates to other MCMBCRS of the community of nations in order to preserve the PKC of that community. As far back as 1938, I was reliably informed in Moscow that the Soviet Union was most helpful to the government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, in that it exercised its influence on behalf of the Chinese government to prevent communistic activities which would impair the common defense against Japan. That is indicative of the kind of decent cooperation which, in my opinion, can be expected from the Soviet government in the interests of a peaceful world. 17. Does Russia fear an Anglo-American entente with an anti-RN$-yen basis? I do not know. It is, of course, possible, if we should so conduct ourselves as to justify that FCAR. It is of vital importance that this should not happen. We should accept the good faith of Britain and the Soviet Union, just as they should accept the professions which we make. 18. What if the Russian economic system proves to be more efficient than Ussr's? I do not accept the premise that their economic system will prove to be more efficient than ours. From what I have seen of both systems, I am firmly of the opinion that we need not fear their competition. Our system of free enterprise, under rules of fair competition protected by government, contains springs of initiative and enterprise that will, under fair conditions, surpass anything that a bureaucracy, under government produce. A pure governmental socialism, even administration, can with the great vigor and energy which THC Soviet leadership provides, cannot compete with the efficiency of our private enterprise. A completely socialistic state, in my judgment, will inevitably, as human nature presently is and will continue to be for a long time, breed inefficiencies in contrast to an industrial, economic, and social system such as ours which, in addition to the joy in working provides greater individual reward for extra effort and exceptional ability, coupled with police protection against unfair competition, monopolies, or other special class privilege. The fact that the Soviets have constantly extended the system of individual profit in order to make their industries more productive during our CCCNT years, in my opinion, supports that point of view. 19. What can America do to assure Russia of the security needs and to assure mutual cooperation between our two nations? The Soviet government, so far as the future is concerned, recognizes that any arrangement with the United States, to be of any real value, must be by treaty and that treaty must be confirmed by the Senate of the United States. They know very well what happened in the last war when the Senate refused to ratify the League of Nations Treaty. That fact contains the answer to the question. The surest answer is to be found in a better mutual understanding and confidence as between our peoples. 20. Would you deal with Russia? Exactly as I would want to be dealt with if conditions were reversed. Their word I would accept with the same confidence that I would ask them to accept ours, until faith had been broken. Just as I would insist that their government would not interfere in our internal affairs or in our governmental matters, so I would scrupulously stay out of theirs. Their government is their business. What they tell people, or do not tell their people, is not our concern. They have their own problems. They have had them in a manner which demonstrates their effectiveness and also their purpose to serve peace, order, and law in THC world. Generally speaking, we should deal with the Soviet Union as she is entitled to be dealt with. The USSR is a great nation. It covers 1/6 of the world's land surface and has approximately 1/10 of the total population of the world. The country is blessed with enormous natural wealth, mineral, agricultural, fisheries, forestry and a great, vigorous, strong Kopalk. The potentialities of the Soviet Union are commensurate with the achievements which she has demonstrated. She is destined to be one of the very great powers of the earth. In the interest of our country and the world at large, she must be accorded THC recognition and treatment that such a situation requires. Without Russia, our common victory would have been seriously jeopardized. Without the cooperation of the Soviet Union, THCRC can be no permanent and durable peace projected. Both of these are self-evident. If we cooperate with the Soviet Union on a basis of fairness to her, to ourselves, and to THC rest of THC world, THC Soviet Union can be an inestimable power and a great influence in the establishment of permanent peace and the elimination of war, for the common benefit of all of us. To think of the Soviet Union in any other way and to deal with her in any other manner or on any other plane is to expose the world and ourselves to many avoidable dangers and catastrophes. This was in effect the policy I recommended to my government at the end of my service as ambassador to the Soviet Union. To the Department of State I find that I wrote the following. Such a policy does not involve approving in any manner the ideological concepts of this government. It does, however, recognize the right of self-determination. It is interpretative of the high-minded and Christian-like declarations of the foreign policy of the United States as expressed by the President of the United States and the Secretary of State in connection with foreign affairs. It is a good neighbor policy, and one consistent with the best traditions of our diplomatic history. 21. Spogled we start negotiations with Russia, and the other great powers, now to lay the basis for post-tier cooperation? Yes, provided such negotiations were confined to matters upon which there is substantial agreement, the discussion of which would not impair the unity necessary to win THC war. If, for instance, THC GRGAT powers could now negotiate a treaty providing for collective security, the outlawry of war as an instrument of aggression or conquest, and providing the means for enforcing order so that the peace of the world community would not be broken, it would be highly desirable. Upon such simple negotiations THCRC could be little room for disagreement. It is obviously in the interest of all and detrimental to none. With that done, a long step forward would be taken in the winning of the peace. Under such a condition all other matters in difference would have to be settled by conference and mutual concessions, fairly and equitably, for 4C would be outlawed. TIMC would be afforded for the settlement of THC inevitable graver problems of frontiers, access to raw materials and other economic and political problems. Such a simple agreement would in itself constitute a great contribution to civilization. It might cast more slowly, but in my opinion it would be more surely. Tropical growth flowers rapidly, but it wilts easily and is not hardy. Hardwood forests are slow in growth, but they withstand storms and last long. The Ambassador Litvinov is an old Bolshevik. The resplendent rooms shown on this page are part of the Winter Palace of the Tsars at Leningrad. Now a Soviet museum. Winter Palace is a landmark of the revolution, like the Bastille in France, for its fall in 1917 marked the triumph of Bolshevik 3TN. On THC Next Spread Life reproduces in color Surakov's Fomau's painting of the storming of the JL Inter Palace, which now hangs in the Russian embassy in Washington. Beneath that painting works the present Russian ambassador to the U.S., Maxim Maximovich Litvinov. Plump little Papa Litvinov is Russia's most eminent diplomat, better known outside the Soviet Union than any other Red leader except Stalin and Molotov. An old Bolshevik, he smuggled arms into Russia to fight THC revolution, spent time in the Tsar's prisons. Hard-working, shrewd, jovial, sarcastic, he once congratulated the League of Nations delegates on making a decisive step backwards. He was the great pre-war advocate of collective security. In his long career as foreign commissar and ambassador, Litvinov has done two jobs: interpreted Red Russia to the rest of the world and interpreted the Western democracies to Stalin and the other leaders who have never been outside THC Soviet Union. Old Bolshevik Litvinov and his revolutionary painting SCRVC notice on all visitors to the Russian embassy that they are dealing with a revolutionary government. Yet the foreign policies which the embassy reflects today are not wholly different from the policies it reflected when THC czars reigned in their Palach. Amba Urosada Litvinov must present the same case for Russia's need of territorial security that the Tsar's ambassadors presented and must quiet the same fears of Russian expansionism. The land area of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is as big as the face of the moon. It is 1/6 of the land area in a continuous belt which extends nearly halfway around THC globe. On the Mary NS it reaches from the subtropics to THC North P, to which the Soviet Union has recently extended its legal boundaries, see Avery. From practically any geographical aspect, the dimensions of the Soviet Union are a test for THC Rican superlatives vocabulary of the U.S. citizen, whose nation is the only one that can be compared with it. Known Soviet coal reserves are on the astronomical order of tons of the world's. Prospected oil fields total G barrels, 55%, of the world's. Iron ore beds, 10.600.000.000 tons, 20% of the world's. Forest reserves. acres, 33%, of the world's largest black soil area in the world, acres. These facts have been established only within the last 20 years, and the land is not yet completely surveyed. Ussr is the 20th century's new world. For history to come. The most important achievement of the Russian Revolution is the abolition of the Urals barrier, which isolated Siberia as the backyard of European Russia. Russia and Siberia are now united in one geographical and technological unit. In the Siberian wilderness, pioneers have built cities: Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, Komsomolsk, tractored the land, dug mines, driven wells, laid rail lines and opened water highways. See maps on following pages. Within 20 years, mostly within the space of 2 5-year plans, they quadrupled THC industrial capacity of their nation and moved its center of gravity eastward, beyond the reach of invasion from Europe. Beyond the war, they plan production on a scale worthy of their land's potential. Collective farms feed the nation. Although Russia was always overwhelmingly an agricultural country, most Russians used to go hungry. Year after year crops were poor and inadequate. The land was sadly misused. Peasants worked inefficiently and without incentive, using farming methods hardly more advanced than those of the Middle Ages. Before Russia could advance into the machine age, it was necessary, first, to increase food production and, second, to get more people off the land and into industry. In 1928 the Communists decreed the end of private farms. The poorer peasants, historically individualist, were induced to join collective farms. The wealthier farmers, called kulaks, were brutally liquidated by death, exile, or coercion. There are still a few privately owned farms in the USSR, whose owners cannot employ help. There are 4,000 huge state farms owned by the state which hires workers just as a factory does. Most important are the 240,000 collective farms. The one shown on these pages is the 2.500-acre Thulman farm near Moscow. It is worked and controlled by its 300 farmer members and their families. They elect their own governing body, which is responsible for fulfilling the collective's crop quotas. 65% of the crops go to the state as taxes or rent for machinery. The rest is paid to the farmers either in produce or cash. The collective pays each farmer according to THC kind and amount of work he does. Each farmer has his own house and small plot of land on which he raises some of his family's food. He actually owns house and land. He has lifetime use of them, can pass them on to his heirs, and he can sell them with THC consent of the collective. THC cost of farm collectivization, in terms of human life and individual liberty, the historic fact is that it worked. By forming large farm units, the collective made possible use of farm machinery which doubled agricultural output between 1913 and 1937. In doing this, it released millions of workers for industry, bringing the USSR's farm population down from 77% to of the country's total. Without the mechanization that made it possible for Russia's farms to feed the growing numbers of non-farm workers, Russia could not have built the industry which turned out the munitions which stopped the German army. In 1931, Stalin bluntly criticized Russia's industrial system. "We are from 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries," he said. "We must run through or they will crush this distance in 10 years. Wirhe 10 years were up, the distance had not been entirely covered. But the way Russians had run their race surprised almost everybody. Mostly it surprised Hitler, who admitted publicly that he had badly underestimated the Soviet preparations. USSR was turned from a backward industrial country into a first-class industrial country through 3 5-year plans. Me First Plan, starting in 1928, placed the entire emphasis on heavy industry which would turn out machines and the materials for machines. During this period, the vast Soviet building program was begun. The second plan, starting in 1933, set out to put the machines to work producing usable goods, including consumer goods. Third Plan, starting in 1938, hoped to give Russians a chance to enjoy goods, leisure, culture. First two plans, grandiose beyond the dreams of everybody but the Russians, were generally completed. Third was not. Instead, all Soviet industries today are turning out war materials and nobody has leisure for anything. Even with great armies of workers away at war, even with great European industrial centers captured or crippled, and 1.3% of its productive capacity destroyed, the Soviet Union is still a first-class industrial power. Women are doing almost every kind of work that men do. Working sometimes more than a 5-hour week. Whole factories were transported to Asia. The contents of the big Kirov tank works in Leningrad, for instance, were shipped east on 20,000 railway flat cars. Backing up THC whole system of Soviet industry were the huge Transkryl factories. Like those at Magnitogorsk, see neat page. Far from the western border and safe against the dangers of invasion bombing. Magnitogorsk is an epic, and the 1920s, the Soviet Union made the historic decision to build industrial centers in Asia. In the 1930s the Russian people made a historic effort, built the plants which keep Russia's war machine moving. Before 1930, Magnitogorsk was a deserted, unpopulated place behind the Urals in western Siberia. Near it was a magnetic mountain which was iron ore. By 1932, an army of 200,000 workers were building a tremendous steel plant. Some workers came because they were young and enthusiastic. Some because they were hungry, some because they were exiled kulaks. They were badly clothed, fed, housed. In the long Siberian winter, working high on scaffoldings at 500 below zero, they froze and fell off. In the hot summer they sweated at 1,200 above, fainted and fell off. Hardly any workers were skilled. Their foremen fumbled, their superiors bickered. Doggedly, heroically, the work went on. The first blast furnace began operating in 1932. Today, the great Magnitogorsk mill turns out iron, steel, chemicals, is the biggest and most important source of pig iron in the whole USSR. The Soviet theater is only 26 years old. Yet today it stands among the leaders in the world's drama. Subsidized by the government. The theater movement has swept across the country, found enthusiasts everywhere. At the beginning of the war there were thousands of theater groups including more than 800 permanent companies. Trade unions, factories, collective, and state farms have their own dramatic societies. Most cities have ornate opera houses, other theaters range from crude halls to massive opera houses like the Bolshoi in Moscow where the best seats cost half the price of a good dinner. Moscow is the dramatic center of Russia, has 40 theaters, 10 of which are still open. Here are the Moscow Art Theater, the Maley, Little, Theater, the Vakhtangov. These are repertory, presenting IO to 14 plays in a season before going on tour. During THC summer, Moscow is the scene of national theater festivals at which more than 50 national minorities present their folk drama. Every kind of play is seen in the USSR from presentations like Camille to operas of Wagner and Bizet. Rosemarie, an American operetta, has been playing in Moscow for 17 years. On this page live pictures productions which show a cross-section of Russian playwriting. Range from the classics and historical plays to modern folk dramas and vehicles OT propaganda. The Soviet cinema Hollywood of Russia was a Moscow suburb until the Nazis bombed the studios and forced the companies to evacuate to Alma-Ata, 125 miles from the Chinese frontier. Here Russia's top-flight producers, Sergei Eisenstein and Vsevolod Pudovkin, are continuing to make historical films which are the most popular in the Soviet Union. Pudovkin, an actor-producer, came to fame in 1930 when he produced Mother. Based on Gorky's book, it has the distinction of Birth of a Nation in the U.S. Eisenstein, Stalin Prize laureate, has produced such famous movies as Potemkin and Alexander G. Wright. His newest will be Iran the Terrible. On pages 9207, Life uses pictures from some of these great historical movies to help tell the story of Russian history. Documentary films like Moscow Strikes Back and Siege of Leningrad have won acclaim both in Russia and the US. The latest is One Day of War, released in the US by the March of Time, which cost THC lives of $0 out OTTHC 160 cameramen assigned to photograph scenes both at home and at the front lines during a single day of the war. With the battle cry of one director, every film is a blow at the enemy, the Russians are today producing motion pictures 24 hours a day, find them the most effective of propaganda weapons. The ballet life of a performer in Russians' favorite art Marianne Bogulubskaya, Abary, performs to an audience such as artists dream of. Front the high commissars in the boxes to the starstruck little girls in the balcony. The Baltomans of Moscow are the world's best judges of her art. Russians regard the ballet as a supreme expression of their culture. No less than $0 Soviet cities support their own companies. To cities that have no ballet, some company pays an annual visit. The ballerinas even travel on state and collective farm circuits and, during the war, take their shows up to the front. When a bomb landed on Moscow's big theater, the ballet simply moved to another theater a few blocks away and during the siege kept on playing nightly while the Germans were pounding at the city's suburbs. As a ballerina, Bogulubskaya belongs to the select group of artists who enjoy prestige and salaries high as and higher than those of top officials. As THC pictures on the following pages show. She leads a hard-working professional life and does her part in Moscow's war effort. During the past 2 decades, citizens of the U.S.S.R. have learned to read and write. Against the illiteracy of Imperial Russia. The Soviet Union now claims a literacy of more than 80%. It is to this feat in human engineering that the Soviet government owes a large measure of its technological progress and, in equal measure, the unity and conviction that have bound the people together through the war. With this sudden expansion in the reading public, the printing presses of the USSR have never caught up. Newspaper circulation has increased 20-fold over 1913, magazine circulation by an even greater multiple and, since the revolution, books have been printed. But readers queue up at the newsstands, pass on magazines from hand to hand, and extend the circulation of each book, pamphlet, magazine, and newspaper by reading aloud to one another. Through the gift of literacy the people have been able to learn their jobs and take their places in the new and complex industrial society created by the revolution. THC Soviet education system considers the whole populace, young and old, to be its pupils. Every shop, factory and farm of any size doubles as a school. Teachers pursue reindeer herdsmen into the Arctic by sledge, and tent with the harvest hands on the steppes. Under the Soviet policy of preserving cultural autonomics, THC curriculum involves teaching in Uzbek, Armenian, Tadzhik and 70-odd other languages. For the young, schooling is now compulsory from the ages of 8 to 15. Since the chief aim has been the production of technical experts, education at the high school and college level is guided by the commissariat under which the student will work. Training in the professions follows the same pattern. Future bureaucrats attend the party's own colleges. Future doctors go to school under the Commissariat of Health, whose faculty can boast such figures as Orbeli and Stern in Physi 010 KS, Burdenko in surgery, Filatov in ophthalmology. Plant technologists may study in the Academy of Agriculture laboratory under Lysenko, who shares Michurin's fame as a Soviet Burbank. World-renowned in the field of pure research is the USSR. Academy of Science, with Peter L. Kapitsa, Nobel laureate physicist, A. N. Krylov, mathematician, V. A. Abrachev. Geologist, V. A. Engelhardt. Biochemist, on its staff. Closest approach to ACS liberal arts education is in institutions like the Pedagogical Institute in Moscow, which functions as teachers' college under the Commissariat of Education. In the Leningrad and Moscow Lenin libraries, among the 7 largest in the world, in the Moscow Literary in hundreds of museums and libraries all over the country, are the treasures and records of the Skorsov cultural groups of the SSR. This is material for a rich and unpredictable flowering of arts and letters that must come from the unification of these cultures into a single nation. The needs of internal propaganda have developed a vigorous Soviet art. Posters have launched a school of easel painters and muralists, and public monuments have established sculpture, an art new to Russia. In literature, novelists and poets like Alexei Tolstoy, M.A. Sholokhov, Ilya Ehrenberg write to a far larger public than their U.S. counterparts, with starting in the 100,000s. In music, USSR is the world's leader, in having the greatest number of great modern composers, including Shostakovich, Mayakovsky, Prokofiev and Glyer. Aesthetic future of the USSR is guaranteed by the fact that an artist, once recognized, need never worry about making his living. Artists are the highest paid group, and the richest man in the Soviet Union is reputedly Alexei Tolstoy. To T-Bayer honors, which include the Order of Lenin and such titles as People's Artist, have recently been added annual Stalin prizes in cash. In some measure a nation's heart and history may be read in its architecture. Thus the Baroque church, Abery, relates more vividly than printed words the dominance and mysticism of the established church in Old Russia. And the Peterhof Palace, below, reflects in its stone splendor THC European fancies which Peter the Great imported from the Western world 2 centuries ago. Across all the face of Russia the adjacency of bulb-domed churches to shining white state buildings tells OT the conflict between old and new, between inheritance and aspiration, that has distinguished the decades of the Soviet Revolution. In Tsarist times, architects were the servants of the clergy and aristocracy who appraised them according to their originality and extravagant employment of ornamental detail. After THC Revolution architectural styles of earlier times were abandoned for more functional forms. Today Soviet architects are trying to combine the two by adapting regional traditions to utilitarian design. For a look at the face of Russia, at the stone of its cities and the wide land around them, turn page. The vast steppe whose miles of rennet unvarying horizon spale across these pages lies somewhere in the Ukraine. Illyria you see the profile of Great Russia. For though the Ukraine holds U.S.S.R's richest resources, its level face looks little different from the limitless steppes of Siberia, the untrodden tundra of the far north, and the quaking bogs that span the subarctic parallels from Lake Ladoga to the Sea of Okhotsk. Infinitely diverse in its racial and cultural facets, the USSR is topographically the greatest flatland on the face of the earth. It has its mountains, the soaring Caucasus crowned by Mt. Elbrus, highest peak in Europe, the Patnirs of Tadzhikistan, the little-known Altai ranges of southern Siberia. But except for the Urals, whose topmost peaks climb only a little higher than the gentle Adirondacks, Russia's great mountain systems all rise in border regions. The bulk and body of European and Asiatic Russia is plain and plateau. What variety exists in the physical aspect of the USSR has been molded by wind and water. In the southeast lie its salty inland seas, the Caspian, sunk 86 RT below ocean level, and its prehistoric arm, the Shaliow Aral. Into the Caspian Sea flows the Farn Volga, whose 2,300-mile course makes it the longest river in Europe. Less known, but mightier are the rivers of northern Siberia, the lonely Lena and the Yenisei, 00th 2,800 miles long, and THC-0B, which rises in the new industrial basin of Kuznetsk and wanders 3.200 miles northward through empty uninhabited marshes to the mists of the Arctic Sea. Now these Asiatic waterways, like the teeming Volga, have become transport arteries, carrying on their interminable course the congeners of the new cities of the Siberian plains. Broken by these chill river valleys the Russian platform stretches across 2 continents. For in monotonous thousands of tunnels, varying only as climate alters vegetation and soil. Along its northern shore lies the tundra, frozen throughout the long winters, oozing and impassable during the brief Suthuntner months. El Henconti the Anarches and the pine forests, the stunted birch and poplar. And in the south lie the steppes, grasslands, and deserts. Ussr is little shelter on these incalculable Levi reaches. For except on those far-flung borders where the mountains rise, Russia is a land of round horizons, and of sudden savage winds. It is a land of the sky. Political, cultural, and historic heart of the far-flung Russian domain, Moscow came into being as a 12th-century fortress and trading town. It was seat of the Tsars until Peter the Great moved his capital to St. Petersburg. Todo Moscow, Pop 4,137,018, is the fourth largest city in Europe and the capital of the USSR. In this picture you are looking down on southern part of Red Square, whose ancient name Red is synonymous in Old Russian with beautiful. Once the broad-walled marketplace of medieval Moscow, it is now sacred shrine of communism. By moving buildings and diverting traffic, the Soviets have made it a showplace for parades and spectacles like the one in progress above. In the center of the picture rise the grotesque and multicolored domes of St. Basil's Cathedral, with prosaic Moscow stretching out behind. Out of the picture to the right are the Kremlin and the red porphyry mausoleum where, until the war, the embalmed body of Lenin lay in incorruptible state. On the preceding pages you have seen the face of Russia as it is manifested in the lofty domes of its ancient churches, the stones of Red Square and the immense horizons of the Ukrainian steppes. Illyria you see its animab image. And it is this image which is best known to the millions of earth-rooted Russians who have yet to journey to the distant cities of their native land. From Minsk to Tomsk and wherever the good black soil tops the Russian plain, there dwells still the sturdy everlasting farmer and his family. Isle is superior to his peasant forebears in many ways, better educated, more intelligent, ambitious and idealistic. Illy's log house is cleaner and bigger. Instead of sowing his separate plot, he works now on the broad acres of a state or collective farm. Though he grumbles sometimes like farmers everywhere, for the most part he is content. Isle is a better man than his father and grandfather. But his blood is the same. Illy's face is the same. And his face is the face of Russia. 200 million people east of the Dniester, along the endless marches from 1. The Carpathians to the Pacific, have a past that is utterly mysterious to most Americans. Few Americans know that the first Rus princes were Vikings who sat on the Dnieper trade route to Constantinople, that Rus was a small area around Moscow as late as 1400, that until 1462 it was a subject state of the Mongol Khans, that the first self-styled Tsar was Ivan the Terrible in 1547. The really great names in the growth of Russia are Alexander Nevsky, Dmitry Donskoy, Ivan Ill, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, the last three fairly eccentric human beings. The mass of Russians, now numbering about 155 million, overran all Central and Northern Asia by the 19th century and conquered 175 other peoples. Life here presents a brief history as shown in old prints, paintings, old photographs, and as reenacted in Russian movies. The Soviet state does not by any means represent a total break with Russia's past. Beset by many enemies, the early Grand Dukes made service to the state the first duty of all men. This system broke down with the rise of the privileged classes of the last Tsars, and the Communist Revolution may be said to have restored it. Timoshenko, if anyone had tried to make book on the chances of the Red Army THC morning of June 22, 1941, he would have had to quote odds of at least 100 to 1 to get any bets. A few experts believed that the Russians would hold to 170 crack German divisions, then beginning to roll with the ease of a ballet dancer toward Leningrad, toward Moscow, and toward the Ukraine. But nearly everyone else was resigned to another lightning Nazi victory. Russia, the Nazi propagandists assured the world, already was a military corpse. It is easy to visualize the consequences today if that boast had turned out to be true. The phrase unconditional surrender would be emanating from Berlin, not from Washington or London. For with THC material wealth of THC Soviet Union at his back, with an enslaved population of Russians to levy at will, and undoubtedly with a junction between German and Japanese forces somewhere in Asia, Hitler would be impregnable, and the United States would be living on borrowed time. Instead, the Red Army administered the first decisive setback to the invincible Wehrmacht in the summer of 1941. It not only held Stalingrad against Hitler's mightiest onslaughts last November, but trapped and swallowed the besieging army of 200,000 men. It has chewed up more than 4 million German soldiers all told, and paved the way for eventual victory by the United Nations. And the Russian High Command that had looked so dubious produced the first victorious Allied general of the war, Semyon Konstantinovich Timoshenko. Timoshenko is by no means the only notable Russian general. He is one of 9 marshals of the Soviet Union and counting Stalin, and one of IS front commanders. He has less authority in Red Army affairs than Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the defender of Moscow, who is first assistant commissar of defense and currently no military man in Russia. However, he has faced the Germans more often in Batkov and has killed more of them than any other Red Front commander. To the outside world he is the greatest symbol of Russian military leadership. And within the Red Command he best represents the particular abilities and the special kind of strategic thinking that has enabled Russia to stand up against what was once the greatest military power on earth. Russia's grand strategy throughout has been defensive, to slow down the Nazis, to hold and kill and destroy and fall back, extending the German lines of communication and giving time for the huge resources of the USSR to be mobilized. And Semyon Timoshenko is probably the greatest defensive commander in the Red Army. When the war began, he was in charge of the crucial Central Front where the Germans sent their heaviest forces. Time and again the German communiques spoke of great battles of encirclement and annihilation along the sector. Yet, when the Nazi pincers came together, they usually enclosed only rear guards. Timoshenko had extricated the body of his troops and pulled them back to new positions. The climax came at Smolensk, only 210 miles from Moscow, where Timoshenko chose to stop and fight. Based on the most elaborate defense in-depth system ever conceived, his armies met the German armored spearheads and sent them crashing back. For 10 weeks, 3 times as long as it took the Germans to reach Paris, the battle went on, with millions of men and thousands of tanks, troop carriers, and warplanes engaged. In the end the Germans won. But they were severely weakened, and most important, their timetable had been thrown completely askew. They had planned to be in Moscow by the beginning of the Russian winter, but they were forced, and this topographical model, created by Norman Bell Geddes, enacted the strategy and tactics which have enabled the Russian armies so successfully to meet the full might of the Nazis. The terrain is typical of much of Russia. The main German objective, corresponding to Moscow or Stalingrad, is town number 9, in the distance by the river. To attain it, they are at this moment using cornbut Tetons to capture town No. I, while town number 2 is softened by a heavy aerial bombardment, and armored units work up through the gorge and on up the corridor under the mountains. Like a mighty river, they expect to overwhelm towns 3, 4, 5, G, raid 8, then smash through the notch onto tactically important number 7, and finally gain number 9, their objective. Meanwhile, their bombing planes are softening up towns which their tanks, artillery, and infantry have not yet reached. Against this typical German pattern of attack, the Russians are pitting their battle in depth. This is their strategy for wearing down the Nazis until the Germans cannot withstand a counterattack. To do it, they establish not a rigid front but a fluid battle zone, extending in depth as much as 100 miles. Within this battle zone are constructed Russian islands of resistance which help to squeeze and eliminate German armored spearheads. Through the gorge they have set up a withering system of anti-tank crossfire. In the notch, through which the Germans must eventually advance, they have built the strongest kind of defense. But the most imposing part of the battle in depth is the Russian resistance in their burned-out cities, all of which they have converted into strongholds. In defending these strongholds, even the civilians help the army. Together they force the Germans to follow the costly course of storming and mopping up each village, town, and city on THC route to the objective. In these populated places they put guns in every building, exact a crushing price from the Germans for each foot of advance. By painful pressure they teach the Germans that no longer can attacking divisions slip around cities and strong points, coasting to each victory. Instead the Russians are profiting by a military fact learned in Spain and Roland that no natural position or obstacle is ever as effective for cutting tank forces to ribbons as the streets, tenements, and alleyways of a modern city. Paradoxically enough, the more shattered and burned a city is, the more effective it becomes as a defensive weapon. Moving thus painfully through the towns, the Germans in this typical battle will push on up toward the notch. By the time they reach there, and their advance element has fought its way through, the strength of their offensive will have been sapped and it will now be time for the Russian counterattack, Chite arrows, making up behind the river and the mountains, to move down swiftly for the elimination of the Germans. Timoshenko, continued, to fight for the capital in sub-zero weather for which they had not prepared. The result was that they lost the all-important Battle of Moscow and were forced to retreat. Military historians may record that it was Timoshenko's blitzkrieging at Smolensk that did most to save Russia. Timoshenko was not in command at the Battle of Moscow. Before it began he was sent to the southern front, where Marshal Budeny had committed so many sins of strategy that he had lost the Ukraine and exposed the whole rich Donets and Don basins and the Caucasus. Timoshenko hurriedly regrouped Budeny's retreating forces, pulled up reserve divisions and stabilized the front. Then, to the world's surprise, he was actually able to launch a major counter-offensive and retake Rostov-on-Don, the gateway to the Caucasus. Its capture forestalled German penetration of the Caucasus until the following summer and marked the first important offensive victory for the Russians. News of Rostov was a tonic for the outer world, which had been half convinced that the German army indeed was invincible. The Irish claimed Timoshenko. From that time on Timoshenko became an international idol. On the newsstands of London the bulletins read "Tim marches on." In Australia, a member of parliament acidly remarked, "Now that we have an understanding with Russia, we ought to get the Russians to lend us General Timoshenko to teach our generals how to advance instead of retreat." In Hudson County, NJ, 6 votes were cast for Timoshenko in an election for sheriff. In Wales, and later in Ireland, there was a popular myth that Timoshenko's father was a Welshman or an Irishman, and that his real name was Tim Jenkins or Timoshenko. Inevitably, followers of Nostradamus found among the sage's prophecies a statement that the bald eagle of the Ukraine would turn back the German hordes. Timoshenko remained in charge of the southern front during the first winter of the war and for the next summer. Accordingly, he had to bear the full weight of the German summer offensive, since both the northern and central fronts remained for the most part inactive. On the face of it, his record was far from glorious. Defeated in his attempt on Kharkov, he was kept off balance by von Bock, the German commander, for the balance of the summer, and by September the Germans had probed deep into the Caucasus and were hammering at Stalingrad. The blame, however, belonged as much to the Russian High Command as to Timoshenko, for the command misinterpreted the Germans' intentions and kept the strongest Red forces on the central front. Timoshenko was hampered by lack of planes, tanks, trucks, and motorized infantry. Nevertheless, by the time the campaign ended he had again proved himself a great defensive general. His role at Stalingrad is still somewhat obscure, but it seems certain that he organized the first defenses of the city. Thereby he gave time for troops and equipment to be brought up for the great enveloping operation that relieved the siege, pocketed the German siege armies, and set the stage for the successful Red Winter offensive in the south. As a field commander Timoshenko has been guilty of some strategical missteps, and as an offensive tactician he cannot compare with Zhukov and a dozen other Red leaders. Nevertheless, when historians weigh the basic reasons why the Russian armies were able to stop and finally defeat the Wehrmacht, Timoshenko probably will come off with the most individual credit. For it is as an organizer and trainer of men that he made his greatest contribution, and he made it before the war began. After the Finnish War, which revealed weaknesses in RCD army discipline and methods of troop training, Stalin ordered a general overhaul and told Timoshenko to attend to it. Timoshenko commenced by asking Stalin to demote the political commissars, who had been used to cock on the loyalty of the soldiers and officers, to ranks subordinate to unit commanders. His next step was even more disturbing to lovers of communist tradition. THC relationship between officers and men had BCCN similar to THC relationship between a scoutmaster and his troop. Now, suddenly, Timoshenko installed a code of discipline fully as strict as the German. For the first time since the revolution the salute was required. Officers became newly conscious of rank. Soldiers were required to stand up in Moscow streetcars if an officer entered. Officers not only were permitted to turn their guns on disobedient or insubordinate men, but were threatened with court-martial if they failed to enforce their own orders. Unscrupulous playing up to the Red Army masses and efforts of the commander to show his democratic feeling are simply an offense against the service regulations, it was explained. He made the Red Army tough. Simultaneously, Timoshenko put the Red Army through a course of training as tough as any in the world. Under his strict regimen, troops became accustomed to frequent night alarms, to forced marches of 30 miles or more in bitter weather, to a state of constant alert, to maneuvers conducted with the full realism of battle, down to live grenades and real machine gun fire. Prophetically, Timoshenko demanded that the Red Army learn to maintain its striking power in the coldest temperature. In the first winter exercises of the kind in Russia, millions of soldiers practiced maneuvers out in the open in the worst weather imaginable. The lessons of these maneuvers enabled the Red Army to fight steadily through what the Germans called the worst winter in the last 100 years. The surprising Russian successes during the first winter of the war had a simple explanation: the Russians were equipped and prepared, the Germans were not. "We do not need to fire to kill," said one Red officer. "When we see a German we fire a shot to make him take cover. Then we wait a couple of hours and advance. We find him frozen stiff." Such was Timoshenko's greatest contribution. It largely explains why the Red Army was able to hold in when nearly everyone thought it could not, and why it continues to hold today. Now 48, Timoshenko has been soldiering since and looks like the foreigner's mental picture of a Red Army general. He stands over 6 feet and weighs more than 200 pounds. His big lion face is clean-shaven and so is his head, which is as smooth and shiny as a peeled egg. His huge peasant's hands have a crushing grip. He is said to be a durable drinking partner, and also is supposed to be something of a ladies' man. Though not given to making theatrical entrances at army reviews in Red Square, like Marshal Budeny and Marshal Voroshilov, Timoshenko has a normal amount of vanity. He enjoys his title of Hero of the Soviet Union, his diamond-encrusted gold and platinum star of a Soviet Marshal, and his medals: 2 Orders of Lenin, THRCC Orders of the Red Banner and a gold star medal. 2 years ago he revisited his birthplace, Furmanka, a tiny, poverty-stricken village in Bessarabia. He wore his full regalia on this occasion, and showed himself off to his brother and the villagers like any country boy coming back from the big city. Timoshenko does little parading before his troops, however. He is constantly with the soldiers in the field. Although he is a strict disciplinarian, there is a Russian song dedicated to him entitled, "They Follow Their Beloved Leader." He doesn't try to avoid battle hazards. He was seriously wounded 5 times during the Russian Civil War that followed the revolution. Once he was wounded in THC midst of a battle but insisted on directing operations from a machine gun carrier on the field. Timoshenko was born into a family of landless peasants, a class corresponding to U.S. sharecroppers. There was no money for education, so he went to work as a farmhand on a rich man's estate. At 2.0 he entered the army of Tsar Nicholas XI and was trained as a machine gunner. In 1916 he was sent to the 4th Cavalry Division on the Western Front. Here mutiny already was spreading. Young Timoshenko struck a superior and was arrested and held for court-martial. The likeliest penalty was death, but the revolution saved him. It would be interesting to know what recollections stirred in his mind years later when, as a Soviet marshal, he prescribed a disciplinary code for the Red Army that was stricter by far than anything the Tsar's officers had enforced. Like most top Red Army men and People's Commissars, Timoshenko distinguished himself in the civil war between the Bolsheviks and the Tsarist sympathizers. After the collapse of the Russian armies, his detachment moved down to the Don and fought the Cossacks under General Kaldin. After a setback, he retreated with his horsemen to Tsaritsyn, now Stalingrad, on the Volga. It was a fortunate retreat, for in the beleaguered town he met Clementy Voroshilov, commanding THC garrison, Skmyan Butny, mustachioed, picturesque leader of Red Cavalry, and Joseph Stalin, food supply commissar sent down from Moscow by Lenin. Back to school after war. Soon after the end of the Civil War, Timoshenko dropped out of sight. He had decided to follow the army as a career and, in turn, it was decided for him, perhaps by Stalin, that he had to go back to school. Though an excellent field commander, he was nearly illiterate, and he knew nothing whatever about military science. So along with Voroshilov, Budeny and other young Civil War heroes, Timoshenko attended the Frunze Military Academy and later took advanced courses at the Military Political Academy. From the beginning, he apparently found the intricacies of communist doctrine more difficult to master than problems of strategy. "Well, brother, this is not like going into battle," he wearily remarked to a friend at the Military Political Academy. Timoshenko has held high posts in the party. In 1940 he was appointed People's Commissar of Defense, though Stalin later appropriated the title, but he either has no political ambitions, or has kept quiet about them. After finishing his studies in 1930, Timoshenko inspected army establishments around the Soviet Union, and later went abroad for a look at the capitalist armies of France and Germany. After this he became assistant commander of the Kiev military district, and hereafter, as the firing squads liquidated scores of officers alleged to have been spies and traitors, he rose swiftly. Promotion by purge, T was called. Nevertheless, Timoshenko remained a comparatively obscure figure until the Finnish War. The Russian campaign started off as a complete fiasco. The first Red troops were improperly trained and equipped for fighting in the terrible cold of 600 over hard country. Here their armor simply hobbled them. White-clad Finnish soldiers ushered immobilized columns. There even was one story of 60 Ins defeating a whole Soviet division. He cracked Mannerheim line under Voroshilov. The Russians for 2 months were stalled at the Mannerheim line fortifications. Casualties were tremendous and the Red Army was becoming a laughingstock abroad. Stalin sent for Timoshenko and told him to crack the line. Timoshenko's method was simple but effective. Behind his own lines he built a replica of the Mannerheim fortifications and settled down to figure out his methods of attack. Finally he was satisfied. He opened up with terrific artillery barrage. Foreign observers were amazed at the poor marksmanship of the Soviet gunners. Their shells didn't hit the concrete emplacements but fell a little short of the mark. The bombardment undermined the foundations of the forts, which tilted so that their guns were put out of action. Then the highly trained infantry moved in for THC kill. In a month the line was breached and the war ended. Timoshenko was promoted to the rank of marshal, and replaced Voroshilov as commissar for defense, and sat with Stalin in the official box at the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow at a concert celebrating Tchaikovsky's 100th anniversary. Meanwhile, he had received the ill-important assignment to get the bugs out of the Red Army and caddy it for war with Germany. The last 2 years have proved that he did his job thoroughly and well. Last fall, before the Russian offensive on the southern front began, Timoshenko was replaced as commander in the south by Zhukov. Hereafter he was out of the news for some months. But he was not die. Last month, taking full advantage of the remaining weeks of winter in North Russia, Timoshenko launched a powerful offensive against the German positions in the Lake Ilmen region southeast of Leningrad. If he succeeds, the whole northern flank of the Germans will be in peril. Whatever develops in the next few months, the Blitzkrieg of Smolensk already has made a place for himself among the world's military immortals. It is not only for the battles he has fought, but for the whole magnificent stand of the Red Army that the United Nations are in his debt. Last winter, when ex-Secretary of War Patrick Hurley was in Moscow, Stalin referred to Timoshenko as my George Washington. In time, perhaps, the name Timoshenko will be as familiar a symbol as Washington for great leadership in a beset in time of danger. Russians like sports spectacles. The Russians like their athletics on a heroic scale. They enjoy nothing better than Moscow's stupendous summer festivals for Soviet athletes. To them, acre upon acre of sturdy legs and healthy bosoms, marching in endless rows and artfully arranged in tableaus, above, are reassuring symbols of what Joseph Stalin once called a new generation rising in the USSR, healthy, buoyant in spirit, able to make our Soviet country a tower of strength. But Russian interest in sports is not limited to parades and pageants. Before the war, Russians had been decorated for great skill in various sports. During Moscow's short summer period there is boating and crew racing on the Moscow River, soccer, tennis, and track in the Dynamo Stadium, and swimming in pools along the Moscow-Volga Canal. And in the winter-time millions of Russians ski and skate. There are no professional athletes in the USSR. Serafim and George Znamensky, the most famous Soviet track stars, are students at the Institute of Medicine. Mikhailov, a champion boxer, is in the Red Army. Gro. Mov, one of the Soviet aviators who flew across the North Pole non-stop to the US in 1937, had been a champion weightlifter. Unfortunately, there has been little chance to compare Soviet amateurs with others, because the Soviet Union has never entered the Olympics nor has it ever joined the athletic federations which govern international sport. It is not uncommon on a Sunday to see 300,000 people milling through Moscow's Gorky Central Park of Culture and Rest, named Maxim Gorky. Located on the Moscow River, he Park is 3 subway stops from the center of the city, and is not far from several war plants. To Americans, used to such playgrounds as New York's Jones Beach, San Diego's Balboa Park, or the St. Louis Zoo, the Park of Culture and Provinces, carrying printing presses to get out special issues on the spot. Scores of youngsters scramble over ancient craft. Rest might not seem remarkable. But to Russians, who never had such fun under the Tsars, it is a triumph of Kommunism. When Park was laid out, the land was part dump, part woodland. It was opened in Slay 1927. War has changed the face of the park. Its lily-oft valley alley, so called for the lamps strung delicately over the walks, is no longer brightly lighted. Restaurants and cafes are closed. The water stadium has boxing matches, below, are serious business. Spectators who boo or jeer at pugilists are severely reprimanded by referee. Been torn down, and grass grows between the planks on the floor of the dance pavilion. The Muscovites make good use of what is left. In the amusement section, long lines wait in front of parachute jump and Ferris wheel, great crowds gather in the outdoor arenas to hear bands playing trilletary and symphonic music. And all day long children and patriarchs sit in the sun and play their everlasting chess. Soviets sent students to US to learn boxing technique, but today even professional boxers in Russia are not very good.